Hey everyone, welcome back to my plant YouTube channel. My name is Titus. Now if you are new to this channel, please do consider subscribing. Now in this video, I want to talk to you guys about Monstera care tips. Alright, so chances are if you're watching this video, you either have purchased a Monstera or you probably have seen other people have them and just want to know how to care for these. Now, just a little bit of things that I want to discuss before I get into the tips is that what you'll find is these Monsteras are actually one of the most popular ones in the market at the moment. So they are the Monstera Deliciosa variety. There are different types of other Monsteras as well, and generally all the care tips for all of them will pretty much be similar. Now what you guys will find is that this plant actually thrives on neglect, however not too much neglect, and therefore it's just good to be mindful as to what to look out for and what to be mindful of when you are looking after a Monstera. Now for this specific video, I just want to mainly focus in on the Monstera Deliciosa purely because this is the most common one, but what you guys will notice is there might be other variations to it as well. For example, you might have the elbow version, which is basically the mutated version of the Monstera Deliciosa. You might also see the one that looks like this, which is basically a thigh constellation. Okay, and you can see that there's quite a bit of sectoral variations there as well. Several features of this plant is, number one, it is actually a climber, and therefore it's really good to oftentimes put a moss pole or a pole where it can climb on. As you can see, I've got that red pole right here that I've put it on purely because I want it to have a lateral growth. And also, the more that it actually climbs up, the more that you will start having those fenestrated split leaves as well. So what you guys will notice is at the very base of this plant, okay, the very baby mother plant, I'd like to call it, of when it first started actually doesn't have any fenestration. And as it gets higher and higher, it actually starts developing these splits or fenestrations, what we would call. These plants are very drought tolerant. However, you don't want to leave them too dry for too long, otherwise they are going to have brown tips and brown edges. I'm very I guess fortunate enough to not have any browning on it yet. Therefore it means that I've been looking after this plant quite well. Now the other thing that you will notice is that Monsteras, especially with this variety, will tend to have like a aerial root. So this one's actually an aerial root. I don't know if you guys can see properly there. And I've actually trailed it down all the way back to the soil itself. Okay, and the reason for that being is that I want it to anchor itself. But oftentimes what I notice with any plants, for example succulents, is that when they start throwing off aerial roots, it actually means that it's trying to get more water. And what you'll find is because this particular plant has many leaves, it actually puts out these aerial roots so that it can add additional fluid rather than the ones that's already coming from the base of it as well. So there you go. Just be mindful that sometimes you might have aerial roots, and I've seen crazy aerial roots of Monsteras before. But yeah, I guess that's one of the good things about it too, because it's like an additional added layer and feature that you would want to have. Now what you guys will need to be mindful of, especially with the leaves and its sap, is that it's actually quite harmful to humans and or animals and other living things. However, if you just wash your hands, if it does get into your skin, then you should be fine. But obviously if it's ingested, there might be other reactions that other people might have. However, I have heard that the fruit of this, when it does flower and eventually have that pollinated, is actually edible. I'm not sure if I'm actually willing to try that though, because if it's poisonous as it is, I don't know if I want to try its fruit. I have seen it before, and I will post an image of how that looks like just down here, just so you guys can see. And yes, these guys actually does bear seeds eventually in future, but if you do try to grow them via seeds, they're very hard. So I would just recommend propagating through a cutting for this. In a future video, I might make a propagation video of a Monstera. However, because I really just want this to climb and not actually be bushy, I'm not going to propagate this particular one. I just want it to keep climbing upwards. All right, now let's get onto the care tips. Now, the first one I want to talk about is with regards to watering. Now, when you guys are watering your plants, okay, what I found is in summer, I actually tend to water this more frequently, and I think also purely because I've got this tiny pot for this actual massive plant, and it's getting even more bigger. But what I found is during summer they actually would require more water, and basically how you'll tell if your plant actually needs water is oftentimes they will curl. So for example, this particular Monstera leaf here is curling, and I think that's also purely because one of the aerial roots down here, I don't know if you guys can see, it's just very tiny, is actually quite exposed, and I know that that one's probably trying to get water for this leaf, but it's not able to, but it's not dehydrated. Now, what I would generally and typically look at is the mother plant, which is basically this one. And if it's actually not mother plant, the youngest growth. So if the youngest growth is actually flourishing and shiny looking like that, and or it's out like those ones, then generally what you'll notice is this plant is quite hydrated. Now, I know that this plant is quite hydrated at the moment purely because I just watered it yesterday, but you need to be mindful about overwatering, because like any aroids or like any other plants, these will be prone to root rot if you overwater them. Now, because they have aerial roots, and from what I can see, they're very thick and juicy, that's a good sign that it's actually going to be able to tolerate really dry conditions as well, but not too dry, obviously. And even though I'm saying that it's going to tolerate dry condition, it doesn't necessarily mean that the plant will be flourishing. So as best as possible, if you start to really feel as to what your plant is telling you when it's dry, like for example the curling of the leaves or wilting and all that stuff, then you're more likely to actually ensure that that plant won't die because of root rot. In winter, I try to lay off with watering. I'd probably water this like once every 2 to 3 weeks, or if I can see that the soil is really dry, because during winter they get quite, not dormant, but they won't produce as much energy that they require, and they will try to just conserve that because of the cold weather. Like with all other plants, you'd probably benefit from using rainwater as well, purely because they don't have all those chemicals that's often beneficial for humans but often not for plants. I honestly just water this with tap water, and I think it's well acclimated to tap water here in Australia, so I think if you use tap water for this, it would be fine as well. All right, now with the soil mix, next thing we're gonna talk about. Now, if you guys are trying to grow any type of aroids, especially those ones that actually throws aerial roots, that would actually mean that they require quite a chunky type of potting mix indoor. I'd probably make a different video for it, but I just realized that if you have a combination of soil mix, the type of pot that you use, oftentimes there's different dynamics as to what you would require. The combination that I found that would be beneficial for Monsteras is obviously the indoor potting mix that I've just recently made. So if you guys want to watch that video, I'll link that down below. But what I also found is that the pot that it would probably prefer is a terracotta pot, so that it can actually drain water faster. However, if you do use that, the soil is actually going to get quite dry quite fast as well. So I would probably use a chunky indoor soil mix with a plastic pot, to be honest. Or if you're using a normal indoor potting mix that you just buy from the supermarket, then I would put that with a terracotta pot. So what I found is the ones that they sell in the supermarket is not necessarily chunky, but they're quite condensed as well. But if it does dry easy, then maybe that's something that the plant would require. Otherwise, for me, I have a mix of bark, perlite, and normal potting mix, just 1/3 of each. And yeah, that's pretty much what I use for this plant. The other thing is that this plant can actually survive via hydro, and I haven't really made a video on it yet on how that works. However, I prefer not to use that method purely because it's not going to get the nutrients that it's needing from just water. Plus, I'm still looking around as to what the best water fertilizer is that I can use. So I wouldn't really recommend hydro, but it can live in that if you want to as well. Okay, now let's talk about repotting. So with this plant, if you guys are planning to repot it, don't repot it straight away as soon as you buy it from wherever you buy it from. Let it acclimate into your own environment first, and once it does, probably 1 or 2 weeks, then you'd probably be safe to repot it. However, rule of thumb is that you never ever repot, or you shouldn't repot rather, if it's during autumn or winter. It's best to do it during spring and summer so that they're in that comfortable environment where it's not too cold where they might go into shock. Okay, so generally when I repot, and I think not repotted this yet, or maybe I have repotted it once, still a tiny pot. They like to really be root bound down there. And how you would generally check that is if you lift this plant and the root ball of it is actually surrounding the whole soil itself, then you would know, or it's probably a good indication that maybe this plant is actually starting to occupy the whole pot. Otherwise, as I'm lifting this, I can see that it's only the top plant that's actually coming off. It's not really bound itself around that plant yet, and what you'll notice is it's either coming out of the pot itself underneath, or it's actually starting to come up because it's got no more space down there. So yeah, generally I wouldn't repot it unless it needs to. However, what I have found is with certain plants is if that you repot it in a bigger pot, then it's got a lot more room to grow, and it's actually going to grow much more faster and bigger as well. But this one's growing quite well, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is with regards to lighting. Now with this plant, if it has a lot of green, it means that it can actually survive in moderate to high levels of light conditions. However, I would not recommend you guys putting this in direct sunlight. Okay, I have trialed during summer and that plant isn't doing quite well. It's actually living outside at the moment. This one's actually living indoors, and what I've found is if I put it about 1 to 2 meters away from direct sunlight or a window, then often that's the best condition that this plant will thrive in. All right, now let's talk about humidity and misting. Now originally this plant actually came from Mexico, according from my research anyway, and the climate apparently there is quite humid. So with humid loving plants, oftentimes they would like to have quite a bit of humidity, and for me to increase humidity, I'd use a bottle of spray like this one. Okay, so I just fill it up with normal water, and at least 3 times a week I would just spray them. Okay, just be careful to spray them, and pretty much that's it. Okay, if you spray them, they'd probably like that better, but if you don't, it doesn't really matter. What I found with my Thigh constellation is that when I increased its humidity and also potted it into the right potting mix, it actually started to give me 1 leaf, and oh my goodness, this leaf actually took like I think 9 months for it to acclimate and then finally give me this really nice fenestrated and also highly variegated chunky area right there. So that's quite good, and that worked out for me. So if you want to increase humidity, I would just use misting. Otherwise, it's up to you whether or not you want to use a humidifier as well. All right, now with fertilizer, during spring and summer, I would give it, at the start of spring, I would give it just a tiny bit of a slow release pellet, which tolerates it because it's not giving me black edges on the leaves. And then to top that off, usually every fortnight, I would give it a sea salt water. And then the next fortnight, I would give it some liquid fertilizer that's diluted as per the instruction of whatever it is that you're using. If you're interested to know what products I use, please jot them down in the comment down below, and I'm more than happy to make a video of it in future as well. Now, usually I would mainly try to fertilize this plant if I could see that there's a new growth, purely because I want to make sure that that new growth will get the sufficient amount of nutrient that it gets. But just a caution that you don't want to over fertilize your plant. And generally a sign that you're over fertilizing your plant is that it's gonna have black tips. Okay, so black tips can indicate a sunburn, okay, or fertilizer burn. So obviously if it's not in direct sunlight and you see blackening there, then that is actually a fertilizer burn. If you see browning tips, then often that's an indication that you're not watering your plants frequently enough. All right, with temperature, now because these are indoor plants, during winter, as long as you're keeping them inside of your house, they would actually thrive better. I'm not sure if they are frost tolerant. I would presume not, because the leaves aren't really that, you know, hardy enough. And we don't really have snow here in Melbourne, so I would have no idea, to be honest. So if you guys are living somewhere frosty and you know if this survives there or not, please do let me know down in the comments down below. Since it's not really snowing here, it's not really applicable for me. All right, now with pests. Now, to be honest with you, I have not dealt with much pests with this. They're pretty pest tolerant, I would say. But one of the things that I had encountered in the past when I was moving all my plants from our old house to here is that some of them have developed spider mites. In fact, I'm looking at one right now and there's like a tiny bit of spots there that you won't be able to see in the camera if I show you, I don't think. But if you see any yellowing spots, I don't know if I can actually show you. I don't think you'll be able to see. Nah, you won't be able to see, they're very tiny. But if you see like tiny yellowing spots on the leaf, it might indicate that there's a spider mite infestation there, and by that time it's too late. But what I generally look at with bigger leaves is that there's those tiny dots that almost look like eggs, and honestly they're even smaller than a ballpoint pen, or rather the point of the ball of the pen. Then often if it's in a cluster, that's an indication that there's a spider mite growth there. And I think this plant is gonna need an actual shower. Now, to actually kill spider mites, all it needs is water. Okay, thank God for the online community that's the best way I found. I tried different insecticide to treat my plant and they do work. But the thing that works so effectively and you need to do regularly is actually hosting your Monstera plant to actually get rid of any of those. And when I hose it down, I try to use like a sort of medium pressure. Okay, obviously to not damage the leaves. If it's too high of pressure, or if it's low pressure, it's not gonna wash off those pests. But yeah, so that's one, spider mites. Otherwise, I've had no mealybugs, any scale, or any other infestations from this plant. There are some plants downstairs which I have, and probably because I have more plants downstairs, that I have a fungus net infestation there, and oftentimes I just have sticky traps to actually trap them. Now this one doesn't even have a sticky trap that I've put around it, because here in my office work area I'm not very prone to having them, thank goodness. They probably can't find each other, and I've treated their soil with pyrethrum. So I've found that with fungus nets, as usual, that the way that you would actually kill them is killing the adults with sticky traps and then killing the babies regularly with pyrethrum. And generally I would use pyrethrum religiously every 2 weeks to make sure that they actually do kill off whatever babies that are in there, and also whatever eggs are that have hatched after 2 weeks as well. The last thing that I do want to talk to you guys about is to groom this plant. Now, to groom this plant, generally if it does get dusty or you want to have more shinier leaves, like what I said before, the best thing that you can do is actually hose it down. And the benefit of doing that is, number one, it gets rid of the dust to increase its photosynthetic, or rather the ability of it to photosynthesize. And then the other thing is that it gets rid of those other pests that might linger on in there. The other thing is that if you are trying to groom this plant, okay, I wouldn't cut it as frequently as you should, otherwise it might get quite bushy. If you want to have that upright growth, then I would just let it grow as is. Now the other thing is, if you get yellowing at the leaves at the bottom of your plant, it's actually quite normal. I would just trim them off, cut them off, and then that's it. Otherwise, yeah, this plant actually is a statement in itself. It's a plant that you can definitely put on the side of the room that will actually just grab people's attention. The thing is that I didn't talk about these plants is that these guys will actually grow really massively as well. Okay, if you do look after it well. That's pretty much it, I think. Okay, if there's anything else that I haven't covered that you guys would like to know, please jot them down in the comment down below. Otherwise, if you like this video, then please go ahead and click that like button. If you do want to see me make more videos like this, then please go ahead and click on that subscribe button. Otherwise, I will see you guys on the next video. Until then, goodbye and God bless.